Okay, so you need to know the different definitions of poverty. So there's four definitions of poverty and then something called social exclusion as well. So you need to know all of these, but obviously you may just get a question that kind of asks you to pick one type of poverty and then explain like why that's a useful way of defining it or not. So for each one, have a basic understanding of what the definition is and ideally a strength and a weakness of why it's useful if the government or sociologists chose to define poverty in that way. So absolute poverty is the most kind of extreme way of defining poverty when someone doesn't have the money to buy the basic needs. So things such as food and shelter. It's useful to define it this way because then the government can identify those that need the most support, so it can help target benefits and that kind of thing. However, others argue that it's not the best way of defining poverty because in the UK this is very rare. So if we define poverty as something so extreme, then it means that a lot of people who are struggling aren't going to get the support. Relative poverty, this is being poor in comparison to most people, so in your society. So this is the idea that you may be able to afford the basic necessities, but you couldn't afford kind of more luxury items on occasions or kind of maintain the same lifestyle and standard of living as others. So affording things like running a car, maybe. Pros, this is a good way to define poverty because it takes into account the kind of the culture, the country, the time period that they're living in, how that might change because it's about being relative to that. And also it recognises that most people should have a good standard of living, so it's not just focusing on extreme poverty. But the problem is that if we define poverty in this way, it makes it more difficult for the government to identify those that are most in need of support. Subjective poverty, so someone defines themselves as being in poverty because they feel that they are poor. Positives, it takes into account how people feel and how poverty may impact someone's life. However, the problem is it's very biased. The government don't necessarily know whether that person really does need support. It makes it difficult to make comparisons between people because some people might feel poor but actually earn more than somebody who says they don't feel poor. So it's difficult to find any kind of objective way of making comparisons between who needs the most support. Environmental poverty, so living in an area which has a lack of facilities, there may be high levels of crime, that kind of thing, so a disadvantaged area. Positives, it's useful because it kind of acknowledges the potential consequences for someone's life chances, so things like poor quality schools in the area or lack of healthcare facilities. It allows the government to identify a particular area to maybe build new facilities in or target the area for funding. Problems, just because someone lives in a deprived area doesn't mean that they are poor. So like it's not kind of homogenous, it's not the same in the area. Everyone's quality of life and everyone's access to facilities and everyone's financial situation. And then social exclusion is feeling isolated from society due to the factors that you may not have. So lacking cultural capital or the material factors required maybe to attend certain things, etc., or political knowledge to participate in society like voting, etc. And then different ways of measuring poverty. So there are three key ways of measuring poverty. So this can be using official stats. So if someone is entitled to benefits, then that's one way the government could see that as an indicator of poverty levels. However, that's quite problematic because if you look at the data, some people might not claim benefits because they might not know that they are eligible for them, or they might be embarrassed, that kind of thing. So it's not necessarily always indicating that. And also governments can choose kind of whether they give benefits or not. So the Labour Party are more likely to give benefits. So if we just looked, and more people would be claiming benefits under a Labour government. So if we just looked at those statistics, it would appear that more people are in poverty under a Labour government, but actually it's more indicative of the fact that they are giving more support to people in poverty, so arguably there's less in poverty. So the statistics can be misleading. Relative income standard of poverty, so people look at the average income, and then you could conclude that a certain percentage of people would be poor. So you might say that the lowest 10% of households could be there as living in poverty. This is quite simplistic because obviously not everybody's financial situation is dependent on their income. There's other ways of gaining money that's not just to do with your job. So having other properties, inheritance, someone could be in significant amounts of debt, so therefore their salary would be mainly going on paying that off, and different schemes that would mean that they have other sources of money. Relative deprivation, so this is to do with whether they can meet the standards of living that others can. It can be related to like social activities that they can participate in, different activities that their children could do, etc. And this method takes into account the individual situation and the kind of cultural context that they live in. So Townsend used this method. So he sent questionnaires to 2,000 households. So questionnaires are a set list of questions, and 2,000 households means that it's a very representative sample. He could see patterns and trends in the poverty levels. He could make comparisons between people because he used a reliable method. Also, because the questionnaires were anonymous, they were more likely to be honest about the fact that they were living in poverty if they were. And he asked questions such as, do you have a cooked breakfast in the morning? Do you eat meat 3 times a week? Do you have a bath in your bathroom? Do you own a dressing gown? So you can criticise his study because the questions he asked were very specific. They're also culturally specific. So you could say things like, it's quite a white British tradition to have a Sunday roast on a Sunday. Just because someone doesn't have a Sunday roast every Sunday, it doesn't mean they're in poverty. It just means that they're not necessarily following white British traditions. Just because somebody doesn't wear a dressing gown doesn't mean that they're in poverty. Just because someone doesn't eat meat doesn't mean they're in poverty. They might be a vegetarian. So the questions were a bit, I don't know what the word is, but not fit for purpose, shall we say. Findings, so 22% of the population were living in poverty, and this was significantly higher than the other ways of measuring poverty. So only 6% were living in poverty according to their benefit statistics, or 9% according to the lowest pay. So basically he argued this was the most accurate way of determining whether people were in poverty, and the best way of defining poverty was relative. Obviously, you need to know which groups are most likely to live in poverty and the reasons why. So obviously, if you just look back at the video on life chances, that will explain it. But obviously, you've got women, certain ethnic minority groups, elderly, disabled, have higher chances of living in poverty. Explanations of poverty. So you need to know the cultural explanations. So these are the ones that blame those who live in poverty. And they are put forward by the New Right and functionalist sociologists. So The first key term, so if you get an essay on this, it will be something like, just because have our sociologists would agree that poverty is the fault of the poor themselves, or poverty is to do with the norms and values of the group, or it might just be like cultural explanations of poverty. So your 4 paragraphs would be, that agree with the question, is the culture of poverty. So people have certain values that keep them in poverty. So those are immediate gratification, so not working hard for the future. It's like just receiving your rewards instantly. So as soon as you receive your benefits, spending the money straight away, not saving it. And fatalism, accepting your fate, thinking you're always going to live in poverty and not doing anything to change it. Cycle of deprivation, so this is the idea that those norms and values are passed down to the next generation, and then it causes the cycle of poverty to continue because the children also start to be fatalistic and expect immediate gratification. The sociologist for this is Charles Murray, my fave, and he's new right, obviously. And he used quantitative data, so official statistics, so released by the government, so secondary data released by the government, and he looked at the relationship between things like crime rates and unemployment rates and divorce and births outside of marriage. And he found as more people were getting divorced, more lone parent families were increasing, so were the crime rates and so were the unemployment rates. So he therefore said that divorce was causing an increase in crime and unemployment. So he used quantitative data so he can establish like a pattern or a trend and identify those kind of relationships. And he argued that they were causal relationships, so one caused the other. And also he used a representative sample because obviously this data looked at the whole country, so he could see that across the country as divorce increased, so did crime, etc. So we referred to social security benefits, so that's the American system, and he argued that those claiming from the welfare state were part of the underclass, so those who were unemployed were who were not seeking jobs he was talking about, and he argued that they were usually from lone parent families as well, and that they were less able to socialise their children into the norms and values of our society. So he argued that lone parent families were kind of inadequate at the socialisation process. And then he also referred to this idea of the culture of dependency, which you can make a new paragraph. He argued that the underclass had no interest in getting a job. They saw it as a norm and socially acceptable to claim benefits. Functionalists would also agree with this perspective. So you could argue, like Parsons' idea that the nuclear family is the most effective at the socialisation process, and if a family is lone parent, then they're less able to provide kind of positive role models. You can also use the idea of meritocracy. So if someone's in poverty, it's because they didn't work hard enough, or role allocation. If someone isn't fulfilling one of the lower status roles, or if somebody isn't willing to do a job to kind of make the society function effectively, then they kind of deserve to be in poverty, is what functionalists would say. Structural explanations, so this would be the other side of the argument. So if this was the question, it would be, if these were the 4 arguments, it would be discuss how our sociologists would agree with the structural explanations, or that poverty is the fault of the government, or those in poverty are like disadvantaged by the structure of society, etc. So the different arguments you can make. The first one, poverty trap. So it's very difficult to escape poverty because of how our benefit system works. So sometimes if you get a promotion on a low-income job, you might lose your benefits, so free school meals for your children, etc., and then end up worse off financially. So there's little incentive for people to gain promotions, because if they're going to lose all their benefits that they were getting, they're just working harder, but not actually getting any more money. Or sometimes if you have children, it might cost you more to put your children in childcare to go to work than it would to just live off the benefits that you would get and look after your children at home. So poverty trap is the idea that the way our welfare state works means that it's very difficult to get out of poverty, because promotions end up with a greater financial hardship. Failure of the welfare state, so cutting benefits. Obviously, the benefits aren't necessarily enough, so people can still live in absolute poverty despite living on benefits, because they aren't providing a good enough standard of living. Also, the stigmatisation of people on benefits means that they are kind of embarrassed to claim them, which links us on to the idea of the influence of the media. The way the media represents people in poverty as welfare scroungers or benefit cheats, presenting them as folk devils, scapegoating them for problems in society, so the lack of government funding for the NHS because so much is going on, people claiming benefits, that kind of thing, means that other members of society kind of turn against the poor, and it allows the government to justify cutting benefits. So the idea that everybody who's paying tax becomes brainwashed and sees the poor claiming benefits as an enemy and think they don't deserve the money. And that's another way that the government or the bourgeoisie can benefit from how they can control the media. And also the idea that that then saves them money. And then feminist views, sex discrimination in the workplace, and also the glass ceiling, but also the idea that women are the primary carers of children. Lone parents kind of having to take on the triple shift is problematic for women, because how can you manage childcare and work as well? So women are significantly more likely to live in poverty. Social issues increasing poverty. So globalization, so the idea that we trade with other countries and that can impact the cost of food if it rises in different countries, and also kind of thinking about the fact they have to import those products into the UK, so therefore we have to pay for like the transport costs and that kind of thing. At the moment, obviously the situation in Ukraine and Russia means that there's lots of sanctions being imposed, and we're having to import products from lots of other places, which is why there's been a significant increase in things like grains, etc. The recession, so you can talk about the stock markets crashing, and then the value of the pound decreasing, and then lots of companies losing so much money and people essentially going into liquidation, and that causes unemployment to rise. Post-COVID, there's lots of companies that haven't recovered from the lack of customers that they had during that time, and those companies having to go into administration, and again just being more levels of unemployment as a result of COVID. Brexit, again, is another issue, also in terms of recruiting skilled workers from other countries has become less convenient for companies as well. So another issue in terms of unemployment as well. How has the government attempted to reduce or alleviate poverty in society? So the welfare state, they are the kind of government-run institution in our society who take the money from the taxpayer and use that to pay for things like the NHS, so free access to healthcare, education. So obviously in the UK we don't have to pay to go to school. That comes through the taxpayer. And universal benefits, so things like state pensions, etc. And then attitudes towards the welfare state. So you've got the Labour Party, so left-wing Social Democrat, this idea that they believe strongly in the support of the welfare state, and they think that the rich should be taxed more so that more money can be given to ensure that the rest of society should be given those free services. So essentially taking the money off the kind of most privileged, who obviously would have an excessive amount of money and wouldn't need that to have a very, very good standard of living, and then using that money to support those most in need. Policies that they introduced to reduce poverty, so working tax credits, so people on a low income could apply for tax credits where you would get like a refund or return on some of the tax you would pay. Strengths of that, reduces things like the poverty trap, reduces unemployment because it's a reason to work, because obviously you know you're going to get more money, and if you're in a low income job then you're going to get supported and get some money back from your tax. Disadvantage, they had to get rid of the scheme because it cost so much money, and also didn't actually it didn't actually support those that were unemployed. So if you were unemployed, it didn't help you get into a job. It just made you want one, but it didn't actually find you a strategy to get one. Another Labour policy was child benefits. So the mother receives £20 for her first child and £13.20 for each child after that. Reduces child poverty and reduces like the barriers of material deprivation, that kind of thing. Initially it was a universal benefit, but then it changed to being means tested, which means that you only get it if either parent earns over £50,000 per year. Disadvantage again is the idea that if you were from a lone parent family and you were earning £51,000 per year, you wouldn't get the benefit, but you could have a nuclear family that were earning £80,000 per year who would get it, because neither parent individually is earning over 50. So it was an unfair system in that respect, because it discriminated against lone parent families as well. Also, you could say a third of children still live in poverty, so clearly child benefits are not enough. Conservative Party, so just other keywords here in bold that they might refer to in the exam. That's what they're talking about. So right wing, neoliberalism, conservatism. So they believe in cutting benefits. They don't want to tax the rich. They believe in meritocracy. They believe that the rich have earned their position in society and deserve to keep the money that they deserve and have earned. They support privatisation, so the idea that individuals should pay for education, NHS services, rather than it being given to all of society for free. Policies that they introduced to reduce poverty and unemployment, so welfare to work, so literally getting people from the welfare state system onto the career ladder, so out of claiming unemployment benefits and into a job. They paid companies to hire young people and train them up for 6 months, and then the idea was that they would then kind of take them on more long term, or they would at least have some work experience on their CV and skills, etc. Advantages: it did reduce unemployment, and the government didn't have to pay benefits to them during that time, and it gave them kind of something to write on their CV, so made young people more employable in the future. However, the scheme actually cost more money than it would have done to just pay the unemployment benefits to the people that were unemployed, so therefore they got rid of the scheme. Also, they were temporary contracts. Often the companies stop after the 6-month period. They just sacked their workers because they didn't want them when they weren't getting paid to hire them, so it wasn't a long-term solution. Living wage. So obviously in the UK we have minimum wage. This is the requirement. You have to by law pay someone at least minimum wage. Living wage is the recommendation. The government advise that companies pay this amount of money to people to make sure they can achieve a better standard of living. Conservatives argue that this reduces poverty, it ensures no person's living in absolute poverty, but also really reduces the idea of relative poverty as well, because it's recommending a higher standard of living. And if companies are paying living wage, that's obviously going to be significantly higher than what benefits would be, so it encourages people to get a job. Disadvantage is that essentially it's not a requirement. No one has to pay living wage, they have to pay minimum wage, so therefore lots of companies don't. And at the moment people argue that the recommendation is still not enough to fully decrease the idea of poverty. Power and authority. Last little bit. So in our society we've got different forms of power. So there are two types of power. There's coercion and authority. So coercion is a type of power that uses force. You're making somebody obey. You're making somebody follow the rules, and it can involve the use of threats or violence. Authority is when people willingly obey. They agree with their sentiments. They think it's the correct thing to do. So if you think of like a school setting, generally teachers obviously have authority because most of the time children want to follow the rules. They think it's the right thing to do. They want to learn. So they respect those in authority. And then this word here, so people tend to be deferential towards people in authority, so they respect them, they view them as superior because they see them as someone having a position of status. So you need to know the two types of power. So one type of power is coercion, the other is authority, and then examples of coercion. So you can refer to the idea of dictatorships. So, for example, Nazi Germany. So the idea that one person or a small group have the power, and obviously there's often issues with how they were elected or when the next election would take place, etc. Fascism, so an extreme right-wing political belief system, which often results in racism and nationalism from the leaders, for example Hitler. Propaganda is often used in dictatorships, so spreading false information, this idea that there's kind of an agenda behind how information is presented in the news, etc. Censorship, so restriction of information, having like a closed internet server so you can only access information that's been kind of approved by the government that supports their ideology. Authority, so willingly obey, and there are 3 different types of authority that you need to know. So Max Weber is a Weberian, obviously, he founded the theory, and he talks about 3 types of authority that you may need to explain one of them. So traditional, we accept authority, it's always been the case. For example, the royal family, and then you can, if it was a 3 mark on what traditional authority is, you can say, accept it's always been the case, the example is the royal family, and then you could say like people tend to be deferential because they view them as superior, they have higher status in the society. And this is a Weberian perspective. Charismatic, so we obey a person because we believe they are an inspirational individual, so Martin Luther King. is an example. And then legal rational authority, obeying people because of the position they hold in society, so their role. So that could be the police, that could be teachers, the government, etc. And this is part of a wider bureaucracy. So this is the idea that there's an organisation, there's a hierarchy, there's sanctions, there's a power structure there. And obviously people would need to follow that or they would experience the sanctions. But the idea is that you think that person must be correct because of their position, regardless of whether they're going to give you that sanction. Formal social control, sources of power. So in the UK, the formal sources of power come from the law, and then the government, the police, criminal justice system. We have a democracy in the UK, so government by the people, and that's based on kind of consent rather than coercion. And there are two types of democracy, so direct democracy and indirect. So direct ways of participating in democracy or doing something like voting on a particular policy. So Brexit, the referendum, those kind of things are when we've made a kind of direct contribution to democracy. Indirect is when we elect somebody to make decisions on our behalf. So we've chosen that person and then they would make a decision for us. We have the House of Commons. So this is the kind of place, which is in Westminster, where the MPs have their debates. So there are 650 people in the House of Commons, and they all represent a political party, and then the party that has the most people in the House of Commons, as long as they have a majority, they will be the people who represent the country. So the leader of the party that has the most number of seats in the House of Commons will be the Prime Minister. Proportional representation. So this is a different way of doing it. So we have a first past the post system. So this is where the candidate who gets more votes than the other candidates in that constituency, so that particular local area, elects the MP. If you do proportional representation, that would be based on the idea that some areas of the country have more people in them. So then the number of seats that you would get could be proportional to that. So for example, if there was an area of the UK that had 5,000 people and there was an area of the UK that had 100,000 people, the area that had 100,000 would be related to more seats, for example, in the House of Commons, rather than it just being about beating the other people who stood to be an MP in your geographical area. So most MPs belong to a particular political party. Obviously, in the UK, most of the seats in the House of Commons are taken up by Conservative and Labour. And obviously we have that's not true anymore. We have a Labour, we have a Conservative government. Jesus, sorry, I'm tired. Informal, so also informal social control, so education system, family, media, religion, peers, they're all in formal social control, but obviously you'll have revised that for crime. Theoretical perspectives on power and authority. So Marxists and feminists argue that the power in our society is not distributed fairly. It's not shared out in a fair way. So Marxists arguing that the bourgeoisie inherit their wealth, it's ascribed, they use kind of exploitative methods to maintain their power. They socialise the proletariat into the norms and values of capitalism to maintain a false class consciousness so that they can continue to protect their power and be the most benefited from our society and ensure that capitalism continues because the proletariat have a false class consciousness. Feminists obviously argue that society is patriarchal. Men have more dominance in society than women. They can use violence against women. They protect their power by making up the majority of MPs, superior positions in the workplace, giving women less opportunities to challenge the power and ensure it's shared more equally. Another point you can say here about how power is unfairly shared, you can refer to Weber's concept of social closure as well, and argue that the powerful maintain their position of power by keeping their inner circle more exclusive and not allowing the working class into it. So the example of medical students and not being able to get onto courses. Functionalists, pluralists, and then this point here, which is also Weberian, argue that it's more egalitarian or more fairly shared in our society. So functionalists argues that those in power earned their position, it's achieved status, meritocracy. Those who work hard achieved those higher positions in a legitimate, fair way, and they are in positions of power to prevent anomie in society, to socialise others into value consensus and maintain that conformity and harmony in society. So they are arguing that power benefits all, and it's fairly claimed. Pluralists argues that we live in an egalitarian society, so everyone has the potential to gain power. The government's role is neutral and serves the interests of all. So in our society, we have pressure groups and people can take direct action. So pressure groups are those that have a shared interest or goal, and they can do something to influence the government. So that could be something like a trade union. So the NEU, for example, the National Education Union, are currently on strike trying to improve their conditions for teachers, but also the funding in education for pupils as well. Direct action, so Black Lives Matter protests, Me Too protests, those kind of things, showing how kind of everyday members of society can have power and exercise it to gain power. Yeah, that's all there. And that is it. So, good luck. You got this.